She mocked the janitor in front of the entire company, thinking her challenge would break him. But what happened when he sat at the piano left? The whole room stunned and her ego shattered. For more powerful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to Simply Stories. The ballroom shimmered under a ceiling of gold chandeliers. As laughter and clinking glasses filled the air, it was a night of elegance, a company gala, celebrating record-breaking profits, prestige, and power. Every detail was tailored to impress, from the champagne fountains to the jazz quartet softly playing near the bar. At the far end of the room stood a glossy black grand piano, placed more for aesthetic than use, its lid closed, untouched, and forgotten. Guests mingled in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, toasting their successes and whispering secrets over cocktails. And beneath all the luxury, weaving through the space like a shadow, is the janitor. He moved with practiced silence, clearing empty flutes, straightening chairs, and sweeping unnoticed crumbs from the marble floors. His uniform was clean but plain, his posture respectful, his eyes downcast. To most, he was invisible, a fixture, not a man. But all that changed with the clatter of a tray. A young waiter, flustered and overworked, backed up too quickly. The janitor, glancing away for just a moment, collided into him. Glasses crashed to the floor and silence rippled through the room like a dropped stone in water. Heads turned. The quartet stopped playing. All eyes locked on the janitor, now frozen in place beside the broken glass. And then came the voice. The CEO, standing near the center of the room in a satin midnight blue gown, turned with a theatrical gasp. Her tone was playful, but every word sliced with authority. "Oh no, not the piano room service," she teased, drawing laughter from the guests around her. She walked gracefully toward the mess, her heels echoing against the polished floor, and looked the janitor up and down with amused disdain. "Tell me," she said, waving a hand toward the untouched grand piano, "can you play Chopin?" The question floated in the air like perfume light, elegant, laced with superiority. The janitor said nothing. His eyes flicked to the piano for a second, just 1 second, but something shifted in them. Not fear, not confusion. Something. Almost like recognition. The CEO raised an eyebrow, seizing the moment. "I tell you what," she said, her voice louder now, commanding attention. "Anyone who can play Chopin on that piano beautifully, not just banging keys, might just win my admiration. Maybe even a date." She smirked, waiting for the laughter. And the crowd did not disappoint. Whispers of Chopin, and she's joking, right, circled among the elite. Then her eyes settled on the janitor again. "That includes you," she added, voice dripping with irony. "Unless you can play Chopin, don't even try speaking to me." The laughter grew louder, crueler. Some guests raised their glasses in mock toasts. The janitor looked at the CEO. For a brief moment, not with anger, but something deeper. Then he lowered his eyes, bowed his head slightly, and walked away without a word. The CEO chuckled and turned her attention back to her guests, basking in the applause of her social performance. The jazz quartet resumed playing. Conversations picked up again. The moment, to most, was over, but not for everyone. In a quiet corner of the room, an older receptionist sat alone, her eyes not on the CEO or the glimmering decor, but on the janitor's retreating figure. She had worked at the company long, enough to recognize the patterns, the way people laughed when they should have paused, the way real stories often got buried beneath silk and ego. She had seen something in the janitor's eyes when Chopin's name was said. A flicker of memory, a spark. He hadn't looked surprised, he had looked still. Elsewhere in the room, a young intern whispered to her friend, "Did you see how he froze when she said Chopin?" That was weird. But their curiosity was fleeting, lost quickly in the music and mingling. The janitor returned to his duties, gliding between tables, disappearing into hallways, retreating to where eyes no longer followed. But as he moved, his hands occasionally twitched near his sides, subtle, unconscious movements as if playing invisible keys. His mind was elsewhere, not on mopping floors or empty bottles, but on something much older, much deeper, because what they didn't know, what not even the CEO could have guessed, was that the janitor wasn't always a janitor, and the piano they laughed at? It wasn't just decoration. Not to him. The sun rose on a quieter office, but whispers buzzed through corridors like electricity under the surface. The afterglow of the lavish gala still lingered, mostly in the form of gossip. Did you see the look on his face? One employee murmured at the coffee station. Janitor, when she joked about Chopin, another replied, chuckling. Maybe he should stick to cleaning the piano, not playing it. Laughter followed, shallow and oblivious, echoing off glass walls and sterile hallways. In the center of it all, unnoticed as always, the janitor moved with steady purpose. Mop in hand, dustpan clipped to his belt, he pushed his cart across marble tiles while the mockery passed him like wind. He neither flinched nor responded. He just kept moving. But someone did notice, someone who had watched quietly the night before and wasn't ready to laugh just yet, the receptionist. Older than most in the building, with kind eyes and a sharp memory, sat at her desk organizing schedules. Yet her eyes followed the janitor when he passed. It wasn't the first time. Over the years, she had caught little things, snippets of melody softly hummed as he emptied bins. The subtle motion of his fingers tapping against his leg like he was following an invisible rhythm. Others dismissed it. She didn't. That morning, as the laughter rolled in and out like tides, she kept her distance but stayed observant. She noticed how his hand lingered ever so slightly on the counter when near the piano room. How his breath held for a moment near the closed doors. There was a story beneath his silence. She could feel it, and she was right. The janitor didn't just know Chopin's name. He once lived for the music. Long ago, in a home far removed from the glitz of corporate galas, his mother worked as a housekeeper in a sprawling estate. The family she worked for owned a magnificent grand piano, cherry wood, ivory keys, polished until it reflected the chandelier above. He was a child then, curious and quiet. Each day after school, while his mother cleaned, he would sneak into the music room and stare at the instrument like it held secrets he was meant to discover. He wasn't allowed to touch its strict house rules, but he would sit cross-legged on the floor and watch the piano teacher during lessons. No one paid him any attention, which allowed him to study every movement, every note. At home, where they couldn't afford a keyboard, he drew one by hand on cardboard and practiced what he saw. With no sound, no guidance, just muscle memory. An obsession, he learned. When his mother lost the housekeeping job, the lessons stopped before they ever truly began. Hardship came like a flood. They moved frequently, money grew tighter, and eventually he had to abandon school and take jobs. To help support them, the cardboard piano was folded and packed away, never to be used again. But the music didn't leave him. It simply moved inside, waiting now years later, stirred again that evening. When the lights dimmed and the final clack of dress shoes faded from the halls, the building fell into stillness. Security had made its rounds, and the cleaning crew had mostly gone home. The janitor remained, lingering with a cart near the break room. Slowly, cautiously, he walked down the hall, eyes on the frosted glass door labeled Executive Lounge. He pushed it open, the door creaking softly like it knew something sacred was about to happen. Inside, the grand piano stood under soft ceiling lights, waiting as if untouched since the night before. He approached it with reverence, running his hand along the lid, then gently lifting it open. His breath trembled. He hadn't touched real keys in over a decade. His fingers hovered above them, unsure. And then, closing his eyes, he pressed the first note. The sound struck like a memory come alive, and then another, then a sequence. He began to play Chopin's Fantasie impromptu, and though his hands stumbled at first, muscle memory awakened like a sleeping giant. His body swayed slightly with the rhythm, his head tilted just so, and soon the music poured from him, not as performance, but as release. The room transformed, the air thickened. The piano, that had once been a decorative prop, now filled the lounge with a storm of emotion. Pain, beauty, rage, joy, all lived inside the piece, inside him. What he didn't know was that someone else had stepped into the room. The receptionist stood quietly in the doorway, eyes wide, hand over her mouth. She had returned to retrieve her reading glasses and heard the faint notes from the corridor, what she found wasn't a janitor. It was a pianist. A man who had folded decades of silence into sound. She didn't dare interrupt. She simply stood in the shadows, tears welling in her eyes, watching as he lost himself in the very music the CEO had weaponized to humiliate him. He played until the final note faded into the walls. Then he sat in silence, hands resting on the S. Keys, head bowed, not in shame, but in peace. Without looking around, he stood, gently closed the lid, and walked out. The receptionist waited a full minute before moving. She stepped to the piano and touched the lid where his hands had been. The room was the same, but everything had changed, and the world, she knew, was about to hear a story no one saw coming. The receptionist hadn't meant to record him, at least, not at first. Her phone was already in her hand when she stood by the lounge door. And as the first delicate notes of Chopin's Fantasium Promptu filled the room, her fingers acted before her thoughts could catch up. She knew this moment wasn't hers to keep. It was a truth that needed to be seen, a gentle rebellion against every snide remark whispered by people too blind to see the soul in front of them. That night, alone in her kitchen, she uploaded the video to the staff's private group chat. No flashy title, no dramatic editing, just a simple caption. Asterisk. Think twice before judging someone. Asterisk. The reaction was immediate. At first, a few likes, then a flood of comments. Wait, that's the janitor? Is this real? Played Chopin like that? The gossip from the day before had twisted into awe. Employees who had laughed now sat quietly watching the video on loop, their expressions heavy with embarrassment. Overnight, the sound of that piano spilled from phone speakers in cubicles, break rooms, and home offices. The quiet man they ignored had suddenly become impossible to overlook. The next morning, the office buzzed with an energy no memo or Monday meeting had ever produced. Employees gathered near the executive lounge, whispering and waiting. Some held coffee cups they'd long forgotten to sip. The receptionist stood among them, arms folded, a small smile playing on her lips. At precisely 9 a.m., the elevator doors slid open. The CEO stepped into the hallway in her usual commanding stride, heels clicking like punctuation against the polished floor. But her pace slowed when she saw the crowd. Brows furrowed, she cut through the gathering with an annoyed flick of her hand. "What is this?" she asked sharply, her voice rising above the murmurs. No one answered. Instead, all eyes turned toward the piano. There he sat, the janitor. In a spotless uniform, no mop or broom in sight, his posture straight and his eyes calm. His hands hovered above the keys, not hesitantly, not timidly, but with purpose. Then, before the CEO could speak again, he began to play. It was the same piece, the very one she had used to belittle him. But this time, there was no mockery, no smirks, only the music. Notes spilled into the air with breathtaking precision, filling the room with power and beauty that no one could ignore. The CEO froze, her mouth slightly open, her bravado melting. With every measure, same crowd that had once laughed was now silent, transfixed. Even the building itself seemed to lean in, as if its walls knew something sacred was unfolding. The janitor's fingers danced, his eyes closed, his body moving. With the rhythm of someone not just playing a song, but reliving it. Every crescendo was a memory, every pause a breath from the past. He wasn't just performing, he was reclaiming something stolen, and when the final note faded into silence, no one moved. Then came the applause. It started slow, hesitant, then rose into thunderous claps that echoed down the corridors. Some people cheered, others wiped their eyes. The receptionist smiled to herself, proud but unsurprised. The janitor stood up slowly, bowed his head slightly in gratitude, then turned to leave. But the CEO stepped forward. She looked different, now polished, more human. Voice wavered as she asked, "Where did you learn to play like that?" Met her gaze for the first time, not with bitterness, not with anger, but with quiet clarity. "Some things don't need permission," he said. "They just need passion." The answer cut deeper than any insult could have. She let out a nervous laugh, desperate to regain control of the moment. "Well," she said, trying to smile. "I guess I owe someone a date then, don't I?" The crowd chuckled politely, but the janitor didn't. He stepped forward, not arrogantly. But with the dignity of a man who had nothing left to prove. "No," he said softly. "You don't owe me anything. In fact, I should thank you." She blinked, confused. "Thank me?" He nodded. "'Cause you reminded me who I was. It's not by kindness, but by challenge." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving the CEO standing alone in the middle of the room, surrounded by the very people who had once laughed with her. Only now, they weren't laughing. They were watching her. Not with admiration, but with questions. And somewhere down the hall, a piano's final note still echoed, refusing to be forgotten. In the days that followed, something unspoken shifted. Inside the building, the usual office murmur took on a different tone, less laced with sarcasm, more lined with quiet admiration. People who once brushed past the janitor without a glance now greeted him with genuine warmth. Some offered smiles, others brief but sincere compliments. Even the ones who had laughed the loudest during the gala now lowered their voices and looked him in the eye. The atmosphere no longer placed him on the margins. It had become a presence impossible to overlook, not because of noise or authority, but because of undeniable grace. The same hands that once cleaned their mess now symbolized discipline, talent, and something that couldn't be bought or assigned a rare kind of dignity. The CEO, shaken from her pedestal, found herself restless in her own office. The usual control she held over her environment had slipped in that single moment by the piano. Days later, she sent for him. Formal meeting was arranged, an invitation typed by her assistant, as if she were approaching a high-level consultant. When he arrived, he wore his uniform, same as always, and stepped into her glass-walled office with the same quiet confidence he now carried everywhere. She gestured for him to sit, then cleared her throat before speaking, as though carefully rehearsing each word. She began by acknowledging his talent, and spoke of company culture, innovation, and how his story had sparked attention across the staff. She offered him a role something in the outreach or cultural department. It came with a significant salary increase, a nameplate, and a new wardrobe. He listened quietly, hands resting in his lap. When she finished, he smiled, warm but unpersuaded. "Thank you," he said simply, "but I don't want to become an asset." She blinked. "You don't?"
Oh.
He shook his head. "You want to use my story to make the company look better? I understand, but I didn't play to impress anyone. I played because I had something to say that words couldn't deliver." His tone was kind, never confrontational, but the message landed clearly. She was offering him a spotlight. He was choosing a path. Later that week, while walking past the break room, she saw something that stopped her in her tracks. Inside, the janitor sat with a small plastic keyboard placed on a folding table. The receptionist was there, smiling brightly, and a few young interns gathered around with wide eyes and eager fingers. He wasn't lecturing. He was guiding, letting each of them try, correcting them gently. There was no camera, no audience, no applause, just music. She stood there quietly, this time without interrupting, and realized for the first time that not everything needed to be capitalized. Some things like passion were sacred. At the next staff meeting, the CEO stood before her employees with a different posture. Gone was the smug confidence, replaced by something more reflective. She cleared her throat, looked across the room at faces she once took for granted, and then began. She spoke openly about her mistake, not just the joke, but the culture she had allowed to form beneath her leadership. She admitted that value doesn't always wear a title or a suit. Sometimes it carries a mop or plays a dusty piano in an empty room. She ended by saying, "I misjudged someone because I forgot to listen. From now on, I will." When the janitor was asked if he wanted to speak, he stood slowly, gave a small nod, and stepped forward. The room grew still. "I never needed anyone to marry me," he said quietly. "I just wanted people to listen before they judged." Then he nodded once and sat back down. The silence afterward was louder than any applause. Outside the walls of the company, The video of his performance, originally shared among staff, had leaked onto the internet. Within days, it had gone viral. Comments poured in by the thousands. People from across the globe marveled at the humble man who played Chopin like his life depended on it. Interviews were requested. TV stations reached out. Music halls sent invitations. Schools asked him to speak, but he declined most of them. He accepted a few invitations to local schools where kids had never seen a grand piano, to youth shelters where he taught music using cardboard keys just like he once had. He didn't chase the fame. Instead, he continued cleaning floors part-time, not because he had to, but because it kept him grounded. The rest of his time was spent teaching music. Sometimes in the break room, sometimes in community centers, wherever there was a piano or even just a willing heart. To some, it was baffling. Why wouldn't he take the glory? Why not run toward the spotlight he had earned? But those who truly listened understood, because dignity for him was never about recognition. It wasn't about climbing ladders or proving others wrong. It was in the discipline of practice, in the joy of teaching, in the ability to move people. Without saying a word, it was in lifting the cover of a forgotten piano and letting the silence become a symphony. And in that choice, he became something greater than successful. He became unforgettable.